Hey guys, it's Celestia, and today I'm going to be talking about something that I never thought I would consider controversial: character redesigns. I don't mean redesigns by the character's actual creator, to be clear. I will absolutely do a for fun video about official redesigns like that in the Art Trope Top 10 series at some point, but what I'm discussing much more seriously today is the increasingly popular trend of artists making posts or videos redesigning characters from popular media that don't belong to them. I had always thought that the practice was a fairly harmless and fun one, operating under the assumption that they were largely done respectfully and without the intention of quote-unquote fixing the original design. So I viewed all of those redesigning this character from this show videos as nothing more than a cool, creative way to express passion for the character or piece of media while also putting a unique spin on existing designs. But recently, after a huge artist in the community faced massive backlash for their redesigns of characters from a very popular show, it came to my attention that there was a lot more nuance to the situation than I had previously realized. The issue prompted me to look deeper into the controversy surrounding character redesigns, and in doing so, it was fairly immediately clear that there were a lot more of them than I initially assumed. So because I find this issue to be a very intriguing and complex one, in today's video, I'm going to be discussing why people take issue with these redesigns, the primary criticisms that they're facing, how much of a role context and intention play in determining whether or not those criticisms are warranted, and whether or not, in my opinion, these videos are actually as harmful or disrespectful as they've recently been called out as being. After all, as someone who's always had a huge passion for character design, hearing that one of the ways I'd previously thought to be a cool and creative method of expressing that passion is being so heavily criticized was something that I found difficult to ignore. I may not have ever done a redesign video myself, but I have designed and redesigned characters for everything from nonprofit organizations to investment firms, and have only ever experienced that redesigning being viewed in a positive light, although that is in a much more corporate setting in which it's not only solicited, but sought out and paid for. And while we'll soon go over why that difference in setting plays such a big role in why this controversy is such a contentious issue right now, I'd rather open the video with a more positive example of redesigning with a little help from today's sponsor, Milanote. For a long time now, I've been planning to create a book of illustrations based on Japan, more specifically, focusing on combining the incredibly bustling, modern, urban settings that I fell in love with during my trip there back in 2013 with a more magical element, with nature reclaiming the man-made structures that yokai-inspired characters now inhabit. To do that, though, I have to put my own spin on how those yokai, or supernatural creatures from Japanese folklore for those who don't know, have looked throughout history to reinterpret them as the humanoid subjects of these illustrations, which is kind of like a big historical character redesign. And because there are so many things to do and plan to get this project off the ground, I've been putting it off for a long time, until I started planning it with Milanote, the most versatile organizational tool I've ever used. You can see the board I made here, which easily allowed me to finally put all of my ideas for the book in one place, in a way that not only looks cute, but also makes the project itself so much less overwhelming and impossible to start by letting me break it down clearly into what needs to be done and how to do it. You can see that to-do list here, which I've separated into general tasks and individual art pieces to be completed, a feature that already makes the creative process a lot more organized and comprehensible, something a lot of artists like myself struggle with a lot. Their mobile app lets you write down quick notes on the go so you don't forget them too, so you never need to worry about forgetting a task or idea. It syncs with your phone and you can see them right here, so no matter where you had an idea and wrote it down, it's still all here in one place. Right beside the to-do list is the inspiration section, with two subboards organizing my inspiration images into illustration and photography, so that I can quickly consult all of the visuals that give me ideas when I need them. The references section is similar, compiling a bunch of the photos I took when I went to Japan that I want to use as, well, obviously references. It's easy to make mood boards like these using Milanote's many built-in templates that are perfect for artists and designers, made specifically with creative needs in mind. And it's just as easy to add to them once you've made them too, using their web clipper tool, an extension that allows you to add any image that you find online directly to your boards and subboards with just a few clicks like this. Finally, over here you can see the production section, where I wrote a general summary of my concept for the book and then created more subboards to keep track of the art that I've already finished, which Milanote lets me easily add notes like these to so that I can remember which ones need to be redrawn or revised, and a currently empty subboard of completed assets for it that I've made another note subtly reminding myself to get to work and fill up. With the ability to drag and drop everything you see here, draw directly on your boards like I have here, include images like these to add a personal touch, and so much more, there's no end to the creativity that you can express on Milanote, while also organizing all of your ideas in a way that works for you. And once you have, you can even invite others to view or contribute to your boards. So whether you have a huge team working on a project or just a couple friends, it's quick and easy to let them participate in its development. If you're like me and you're planning on redesigning characters or concepts for your own creative endeavors, there are so many positive ways to do that can all be planned and started best with Milanote, since every idea, reference, and concept can be kept right here, just a click away at any moment. And best of all, it's completely free. No time limit, no free trial, it's just straight up free forever and ready for you to try out right now. So why wait? Sign up for a free Milanote account using the link in the description and start your next creative project there today. Thank you so much to Milanote for sponsoring today's video, and please go check them out. There are so many ways that redesigning characters or concepts can be done respectfully artistically and creatively like I plan to with this project. And whether you're interested in doing the same or just want to make your creative process a lot less hectic, Milanote is a great place to start. That said though, while redesigns like that can be a great way to put a new, unique spin on an existing design or idea, there are other settings in which many feel it to be significantly less positive, which brings us to the more controversial side of redesigns that's been so heavily discussed recently. It's clear that setting and circumstance play a large role in whether or not redesigns are viewed critically. It's one thing to redesign characters from classic folklore as humans. It's another to take a character someone created themselves and change it. That as a concept is not necessarily wrong or forbidden by any means, but it's a delicate enough issue that there's a great deal of nuance to be considered when determining whether or not it's appropriate or okay. For example, many argue that it comes down to intention. Is the artist doing the redesign claiming to be correcting the original and creating a superior version? Or is it a just for fun way for them to positively put their own spin on the original? Few take issue with the latter, but the former raises concerns. If they claim to be fixing the original outright, most would agree that that's largely unacceptable, as fixing art is widely regarded as disrespectful and inappropriate in almost any setting. I have a video on that specifically linked in the iCard above, as that's really the full extent to which I'll be discussing it here. There's not much more that I have to say about any variety of art fixer than I did there, and I view redesigners with that intention as nothing more than another kind of art fixer. So for all intents and purposes, it can be assumed that all of the redesigners I mention from here on out and give the benefit of the doubt aren't the ones that claim to be art fixing. But there is still a middle ground between art fixing and for fun redesigns, which is where opinions become much more divided. Most are in favor of for fun redesigns as harmless creative outlets, and against art fixing redesigns as disrespectful, self-righteous, and hurtful attacks on the character's original creator. Most, however, are unsure of exactly where they stand on the redesigns that fall into the gray area between that black and white. Those who redesign popular characters as a way to constructively critique the original design. This is where things become significantly more nuanced and unclear, which is why before I get into that, I'd like to preface this by making it abundantly clear that while I try to be as unbiased as possible with my videos, they're all just my opinions. This is an opinion piece on whether or not I feel these redesigns are okay or not, and whether or not I think the criticisms of them are warranted, not an objective assertion as to whether or not they factually are. Because so much of this is based solely on individual perspectives, values, and opinions, it's impossible to make that kind of a determination, and I have no intention of trying or claiming to. You're more than welcome to disagree, and I'm not making any objective statements about right or wrong here. I'm just opening up what I believe to be an important discussion about respect, critique, and freedom of expression that I hope others will weigh in on too, even if they do disagree. That in mind, let's talk about that nuance. Is it really problematic to redesign popular characters as a form of constructive criticism, or are people just overreacting to it because they feel like their favorite shows, creators, and characters are being attacked? Is this just another form of unwelcome, unsolicited critique? And if so, where do we draw that line? After all, people review everything about popular media online in a multitude of different ways, from character designs like these to plots, writing, execution, casting, and so on. Is character redesigning, when done respectfully as critique, any different than one of those review videos that serve the same purpose? What makes these any more problematic than those? Does it come down to intention, the difference between intending to offer respectful feedback and intending to bully and make fun of the original artist or creator? Or does it come down to execution, whether they presented their redesign as an objectively superior version of the original, or just what they feel to be an improved version based on their opinions and preferences? It could even come down to scale, the difference between redesigning an individual artist's OC and the characters from a massively popular show that was created by a team of hired professionals. In my opinion, it actually comes down to all three, and because so many factors need to be considered, there are a lot of possible conclusions to be drawn. To start drawing those conclusions and help you start drawing your own, I'm going to go over the criticisms that redesign videos most commonly face, and then discuss how those factors impact whether or not those criticisms are, in my opinion, valid. And the first main criticism of these character redesign videos that I'll be addressing is also the most straightforward, that they're bad. Many argue against character redesigning, not necessarily because they find the practice itself to be morally condemnable, but because they find the majority of those redesigns to be inadequate. And while I have a plethora of problems with this criticism that I'll address in a minute here, I will say that I understand where it's coming from and why it's so prevalent. If someone is going to redesign an existing character, it's not unreasonable to expect that that redesign will be better than the original, since most assume that the purpose of a redesign is to provide a superior alternative to it. So naturally, the standards are high. The redesigns don't just have to be good, they have to be better than the original. And since redesigns are usually of quite popular characters, the originals are often already very well loved. And people are generally pretty resistant to seeing people both criticize and change anything about characters they love. So their expectations for quality when they do are even higher, simply as a result of their personal biases in favor of the originals. You aren't just expected to make a good design, you're expected to take a design a significant number of people already love and improve upon it with every single change you make to it. And that's a high bar to meet when the people who love those designs and characters are already instinctively averse to seeing them redesigned, and most immediately view them in a critical light. That perspective in mind, it doesn't surprise me that one of the most common criticisms that redesigns face is that they simply fall short in terms of quality. If they're not objectively better than the original, they're bad and they shouldn't exist, at least in the opinion of many online. And when they're already predisposed to think those redesigns aren't better because of their existing love for the original, they're likely to be even more hateful towards redesigners that they feel failed to create something better with their work. But just because I understand why this perspective is so prevalent doesn't mean I agree with it, and that's for two primary reasons. One, it operates under the assumption that all redesigns are done with the intention of improving upon the original, which is demonstrably false. Plenty of character redesigns are done solely for fun, without any claims made that they're superior to the original, and with the artist creating them not even meaning to criticize the original. There are tons of videos where artists redesign characters to fit their style, to suit a certain theme, to match a particular aesthetic, to fit into a different time period or genre, and so on, all of which are done to pay homage to the original and provide a creative reinterpretation in addition to it, not to criticize the original and provide a better alternative to it. These videos are then subject to unfair scrutiny when people claim that their redesigns aren't better than the original, because their intention was never to be better than the original in the first place. They were made out of love and respect for the original with the intention to add their own interpretation to the fandom, rather than propose a better replacement with it. They aren't supposed to be better, they're just supposed to be, well, exactly what they are. Reinterpretations, art, expression. Their quality isn't supposed to be assessed in comparison to the original, but rather as a separate work inspired by it that doesn't aim to be superior to it. So judging it for failing to accomplish a level of quality that was never even aimed for in the first place seems deeply unreasonable to me. The second issue I have with this criticism is that it also operates under the assumption that objective superiority of design can even be assessed. Even if the redesigner is critiquing the original and aiming to improve upon it with their version, no one can factually state whether they succeeded at that goal or not. They can say they prefer the original, they can say they prefer the redesign, they can say they like aspects of both or don't have a favorite, but they can't say which one is objectively superior to the other because that can't be quantifiably and accurately measured. It's a matter of opinion. Everyone will like different things about both originals and redesigns, and which one is better to each individual depends solely on their preferences. Yes, there are some objective criteria to be considered when judging a character design's quality. Do they fit in with their universe and peers in terms of thematic elements, motifs, colors, and types of clothing? Is their silhouette distinctive and recognizable? Is their color palette unique and eye-catching without standing out too much from their environment or blending in too much? Is that color palette also balanced and consistent in terms of maintaining a few primary and a few accent colors that complement each other well without clashing or being too busy? There are things to consider when assessing a design's quality that are based on the fundamentals of design rather than personal opinion. But even those assessments will still be clouded by personal bias and preference, and doubly so when you're comparing two designs to determine which one met those criteria better. Informed assessments can obviously still be performed by those educated in and experienced with the fundamentals of design, who are able to set aside their bias and analyze each one based solely on how well it meets certain individual standards of quality. But even then, two people with equal experience and education could analyze and compare the same two designs and come to different conclusions because of how big of a role opinion plays in drawing them. Is that to say that if no objective conclusion can be made, subjective conclusions have no value? Of course not. Expressing subjective opinions about the quality of a design is perfectly fine, and is in fact a very valuable method by which to expand your own understanding of design as you share and compare opinions with peers who may agree or disagree. It might even be helpful for the original creator to hear those opinions and consider them in their future work. But the issue here is that when redesigns are criticized for failing to be better than the original that they're critiquing, the majority of people are saying, this sucks because it's not better than the original, as if that's a fact, rather than saying, I disagree with the ways you claim to improve upon the original and preferred it as it was, and I don't think this is an improvement because X, as an expression of their opinion. I'm not saying it's wrong to criticize the quality of redesigns altogether. After all, if the redesign itself is done as a form of critique upon the original, it's only fair that the redesign be subjected to the same critique from viewers. But only if that's what it is, critique. Opinion-based critique that's subjective and, hopefully, motivated by a desire to help the redesigner improve, rather than simply spread hate towards them. This is especially true when we apply the factors I mentioned earlier to this criticism: intention and execution. There's scale too, but that one isn't quite as applicable to this criticism, at least in my opinion, so I'll focus on the first two, because to me, both determine whether or not it's valid to criticize a redesign for failing to be a thorough improvement upon the original. When it comes to intention, I would consider, did the redesigner intend for their design to be just for fun, as a way to reinterpret a character they like in a different way that doesn't aim to be superior? Well, then criticizing them for not making a superior design is not just unfair and unreasonable, but not even applicable. Similarly, did the redesigner intend to provide criticism solely in the form of their own opinions, changing aspects of the original design that they don't claim are objectively bad, but rather that they just personally dislike. If so, all they're really doing is saying, here are the things I didn't like about the original that aren't actually wrong with it, but don't suit my preferences. My redesign is, by extension, just done for fun to suit my preferences and not provide an objectively superior version, just one I like more. And if that's what they're saying, then it seems equally unreasonable to criticize them on the basis that their version isn't better than the original. Their intention was never to create something better than the original, but something that they personally preferred, and whether or not they achieved that is solely up to their own opinion and not yours. Conversely, did the redesigner intend to provide a legitimate critique of the original that they did mean to be superior to it? Well, that's when execution needs to be considered too. If they did, and they also made it clear that it's ultimately still just their opinion, and while they believe that their redesign is better, they don't claim it to be objectively so, then I would argue that their execution and delivery of the redesign make the "it's not better than the original so it's bad" argument unfair. They were still making it clear through the execution of the design via their commentary that any improvements they claimed to make were only improvements in their opinion. So while it's more than fair to disagree with that opinion, it's not fair to say it's factually wrong. It's an opinion, it can't be. But if in the execution of their redesign, they did not express that it was based on their opinions and instead did actively suggest that it's objectively better than the original, I agree completely that in that instance, it's at the very least warranted to say, no, it's not. Not because of any criteria it fails to meet from a quality standpoint, but from a, it literally cannot be objectively concluded whether or not your redesign is actually objectively better, and you're both wrong and kind of an asshole to say it is standpoint. This is very related to the next criticism that redesigns face, which is that regardless of whether or not the redesigns themselves are thought or intended to be better, it's pretentious to redesign characters to begin with because doing so implies that they're fixing or improving upon the original regardless of intention. And I take issue with any argument that disregards intention because I think it's very significant to consider when judging any kind of morality-based argument. But again, I do understand why people feel this way. A lot of viewers are rubbed the wrong way by videos called redesigning these boring characters and similarly negative titles, and that's honestly fair. Regardless of whether the video and redesign itself is solely opinion-based and it's made clear in the execution that that's the case, it does still strike many as arrogant and pretentious in premise alone to make videos that imply the artist's superiority over the character's original creator. When it comes to this criticism, considering scale, intention, or execution is largely irrelevant because all of those pertain to the specific nature of the individual redesigns. But this criticism isn't directed towards any individual aspect of any particular redesign, but rather at the wider practice of redesigning as a whole, which people who hold this belief find to be pretentious regardless of intention, execution, or scale. And I really can't say whether they're wrong or not. It's an opinion, and if they find it pretentious, they're valid to do so. I understand where they're coming from, because I agree that a lot of these redesigns do come off that way. But I personally disagree with the assessment that all redesigns are pretentious solely because they're redesigns, because I disagree with most blanket statements judging something based not on its actual individual merit, but instead solely on the basis of it being an iteration of a thing they dislike. It feels like judging a book by its cover, or in this case, a redesign simply by being called a redesign. Some are legitimately pretentious in my opinion, when the artist claims that their design is factually better than the original and makes quote-unquote objective constructive criticisms of the original that are based solely on their own opinions and preferences and are not, in fact, universally true or applicable. But some aren't, and they just seem that way until you watch them and see that they're actually just for fun, or just opinions, or done respectfully in a way that makes it clear that no actual superiority is being suggested, nor any harm or malice intended. And I think lumping all redesigns into one category and calling all of them pretentious because they're in it is unfair, because it neglects to acknowledge the factors I consider most important in judging whether or not they really are. Finally, the last most common criticism of character redesigns is that it's wrong to redesign someone else's character without their permission, and that doing so anyway, regardless of intention, qualifies as unsolicited critique if they're providing criticism, and is disrespectful even if they're not and it's just for fun. This is where it gets a lot more difficult to draw any real conclusions because of how nuanced, subjective, and opinion-based any perspective on this is. So I'd like to again reiterate that I'm not claiming one way or another that this criticism is wrong. I'm just addressing why people think it's valid and whether or not I personally agree. In many ways, this argument is not at all dissimilar to arguments made against the sale of fan art. For most, it comes down to their personal perception of the original creator. Many consider it to be fine to sell fan art of incredibly popular pieces of media created by studios, teams, and companies, because number one, they're making massive profits already, and number two, many argue that they're unlikely to suffer any consequences from the sale of fan art based on their IP, because they're so much larger in scale than the fan artists that their fan merch doesn't present itself as a market competitor to official merch. Conversely, most also consider it to be wrong to sell fan art of media created by individuals and small teams, as their profits are much less significant and their bottom line could legitimately be impacted by competition being introduced in the form of fan merch. Permission's significance is also impacted for many by this scale. It's unreasonable to expect a fan artist to reach out to a massive gaming or animation studio to seek permission to sell fan art of their IP, since it's sincerely unlikely that they'll ever even hear back, and unless the company has expressly forbidden this sale, it's borderline impossible impossible to learn or find out where they stand on it. Individual creators, however, can usually be contacted to seek permission. It's at least expected that a fan artist would try to reach out to them first based on the comparatively high likelihood that they actually would answer them. Redesigns from this perspective are very similar. Most agree that it's ethically fine to redesign characters of hugely popular media created by large companies and studios without their permission, while it's much more morally dubious to redesign the characters of individual creators or artists without theirs. This is for a multitude of reasons, one of which I've already addressed, that seeking and getting permission from large companies is almost impossible, and if every redesigner were obliged to get it just to make their redesigns, they'd likely be in a position where they couldn't make any, not because the companies disallowed it, but because they just never answered any of their inquiries. Conversely, it's reasonable to expect that an individual creator could be successfully consulted for permission to redesign their characters, as it's much more likely that they would respond, and therefore it's deemed disrespectful and inappropriate not to even try. I have few issues with this argument because from a pragmatic perspective rather than a moral one, it makes sense. Is it right to redesign characters made by big companies without permission just because both getting permission and being denied it is impossible since they're unlikely to answer? Ethically, probably not. It's a gray area. But does it make reasonable sense to on a purely logical level? I think so. And I think it's equally logical to expect redesigners to seek permission from individual creators that are likely to respond. How they proceed if the creators don't respond in terms of whether or not they move forward with their redesigns is equally dubious. But I personally believe that they do have a responsibility to at least try before making any decisions or commitments. That is not, however, the only way in which scale should be considered with regard to this criticism. As I said, many feel it's morally acceptable to sell fan art of popular franchises and not individual creators' works, because the former is profiting significantly more and doesn't need more money, while the latter does. Similarly, many feel that because the characters present in popular franchises were not passion projects of any particular individual, but rather a team effort in which professional artists were employed to create a profitable IP that they're not personally attached to, it's ethically acceptable to redesign those characters since no individual is solely responsible for their original design in the first place, nor would the team that is responsible be likely to take personal offense to any criticisms presented by a redesign. Furthermore, they posit that in the case of individual artists who have created these characters all by themselves out of pure passion and love, it's inappropriate and unacceptable to redesign them without permission, as it is much more likely to be taken as a hurtful attack and enter the realm of unsolicited critique. To examine this scale-based perspective further, I once again would like to consider intention in a wider sense. Not just the intention of the artist in redesigning the character, but also the intention of the original creator in making the character. Because really, I think that's the closest that we can get to objective criteria to consider here. It's not like we can make a conclusive moral statement as to whether it's right or wrong to redesign a character based on whether or not the original creator is personally attached to them or passionate about their creation, since that's not something that we can assess without asking them. After all, it's not as if it's one or the other. A character created by one passionate individual artist, or a character created by a team of paid professionals that aren't emotionally invested. Individual artists may create characters solely out of desire for them to be profitable and popular with no emotional attachment to or passion for them, and paid professionals working on big projects can absolutely get very passionate and attached to the characters that they create, regardless of the context in which they're creating them or whether they're paid to. We could argue back and forth for ages about it being bad to critique an individual artist's OC design because it's their passion project that they poured their soul into, but okay to critique a studio's character design because no individual artist was responsible for them that would feel hurt or attacked by any criticisms. But since we can't objectively assess whether or not the character's creators are personally attached to and passionate about them, we wouldn't get anywhere. It makes much more sense to do so, in my opinion, based less on the degree of independence and lack of corporate involvement, and more so based on the implication of solicitation for critique based on the original creator's intentions. Now, to be clear, I am not suggesting that anyone but the original creator can factually know their intentions and whether or not the means by which they present their character is implicitly soliciting critique as a result. But I am saying that it walks a similar line to media reviews, and that's a perspective worth considering. It's expected that when a movie is produced and shared with the world, it solicits critique simply by being presented to viewers on a massive scale. As such, movie reviews don't generally face scrutiny as being unsolicited critique, as it's widely understood that presenting a piece of media on that scale is soliciting critique. Conversely, a video review critiquing one individual piece of fan fiction based on that movie would likely be criticized as at best unsolicited critique and at worst an attack, because many would argue that in writing and sharing fan fiction at a much smaller scale, the writer is not soliciting critique. Now, that's making a lot of assumptions that are, in my opinion, based on faulty logic. After all, both the movie production team and the fanfiction writer did intend to share their art with the world, and if sharing that art with the world is an act which implies that they're soliciting critique on it, then it would be appropriate to offer it to both or neither depending on which side of the fence that you sit on, but not one or the other. I've made it clear in my video on unsolicited critique that while I understand the argument that sharing art with others does open the door to critique, it doesn't immediately imply that critique is welcome, and that while it's therefore important for artists of all sizes to grow a thick enough skin to handle unsolicited critique if they're going to share their work with literally anyone, since everyone is liable to give it, they're not obligated to listen to or even acknowledge it, and they're also well within their rights to reject it and criticize it for being something they had no interest in hearing. That's because, in my opinion, sharing your work with others allows the opportunity for critique, but it doesn't solicit it. I feel the same about this, which is why I don't feel like the argument that big projects solicit critique by way of sharing their art with the world, but individual creators don't, by nature of scale alone, is valid. But scale and intention are still worth considering in regard to context, in which case I do feel the argument has more validity, because in terms of context rather than scale, we can actually potentially make something close to an educated guess as to whether or not the work does implicitly solicit critique by way of being shared. The problem is that many view scale and context as the same thing in this case. Because the movie producers are a huge team and the fanfiction writer is one person, they argue that the former solicits critique and not the latter based on that size alone. But in my opinion, it has much less to do with the scale and much more to do with the context. The movie producers are, first and foremost, creating a product. They're creating content to be consumed, sold, and profited off of. Whether or not they're personally attached to it as a work of art is irrelevant in that regard, because their primary intention was not to view it as a piece of art first and foremost, but a product. And a product is implicitly soliciting review, because its purpose is to be bought and consumed in one way or another that subsequently makes it liable to be criticized or praised by those who paid for it. It's not because the movie producers are larger in scale, but because the art that they're making and sharing is not made and shared primarily as a creative expression, but as a purchasable, profitable product. That doesn't mean it's not art, but it means that the execution with which it's presented implicitly opens that art up to critique in a way that it wouldn't otherwise. Furthermore, the fanfiction writer in this instance would not be aiming to profit off of their work or deliver a product. Their intention in creating their art would be for it to be seen, but not commodified or sold. They're expressing their creativity, and that is their primary intention. And I don't believe that expressing creativity invites critique the same way that selling a product does. Yes, both the movie producers and the fanfiction writer intended their work to be seen by others, but I don't believe that that's enough on its own to claim that they both solicited critique implicitly by doing so. The former only solicited it by presenting their art as a product, while the latter did not because they didn't. Again, in my opinion. So in that regard, I feel that there's a reasonable argument to be made that character redesigns of popular characters from corporate-owned IPs are not unsolicited critique, but character redesigns of individually created characters that are not being marketed deliberately for public consumption as content are unsolicited critique. Not because the corporate-owned IPs solicit that critique by being larger in scale than individual creators, but because marketing something as a for-profit product invites that product to be reviewed. I would, based on that argument, say that individual creators and artists also solicit critique implicitly if they're also marketing their work as a product, because that intention alone does, in my opinion, necessitate that the creator is okay with receiving feedback on the thing that they're selling, whereas that wouldn't be the case if it were just creativity they were expressing without any monetary motivation. It's widely accepted that people have a right to review and criticize something they paid money for and had marketed to them as a product. I don't personally feel that that's the case for artists simply sharing their work as a form of expression. In fairness, this too requires context. An artist creating work as a form of expression and also choosing to display it in a gallery would, in my opinion, also be soliciting that critique, simply because the nature of that environment comes with the implied understanding that critique is a universally present aspect of it. In choosing to display their art in a gallery in which they know art is typically viewed critically, with that critical view being a feature of the gallery rather than an unintended byproduct of it being displayed there, one might argue that they too are soliciting critique even if they're not selling their work as a product. And one might further argue that sharing art online is no different than displaying it in a gallery. So if we accept that artists displaying work in galleries are implicitly soliciting critique, we must also accept that all artists sharing their work online are too. And this is where it gets murky, because that really comes down to your personal perspective, values, and opinions. In my opinion, it depends on the difference between a feature and a byproduct when examining the creator's expectations. An artist submitting their work to a gallery isn't accepting that by way of doing so they might receive unsolicited critique simply by way of having it viewed by others. The artist would expect critique to be provided by viewers because that's the nature of a gallery environment. People in that setting are expected to view art critically and share feedback that reflects that. They do pay for the privilege of being there in most cases. And in that regard, critique is not an unwanted but unavoidable byproduct of having their work seen, but rather an intended and expected feature of intentionally having their work seen in that particular environment. And that difference, to me, determines whether or not critique is implicitly solicited by way of art being shared alone. So based on that logic, I am personally of the belief that if the character being redesigned belongs to an individual and is not part of a larger piece of media that they've made as a product for profit, then yes, that could reasonably be criticized as being unsolicited critique. But if the character being redesigned is part of a larger piece of media that is being marketed and viewed as a product, the fact that it's being marketed and shared that way does inherently solicit critique, making this criticism of it unfair in my books. Not because of the size of the team or creator who made the original character, but because of their intention and expectation when sharing them with the world. Even so, that's at best just a rule of thumb based on opinion alone. Everyone will have a different perspective on where to draw the line between appropriate characters to redesign without permission and inappropriate ones. Some may argue that it's never appropriate without permission regardless of anything discussed thus far, and that's perfectly fair too. I don't agree personally, but I completely understand the validity and basis of the argument. The problem with this whole redesign controversy isn't that anyone is wrong about their stance on it, it's that everyone seems to think they're right, and that their opinion on character redesigning is the only acceptable one, while refusing to hear any others. However you feel about redesigns and the ethics of making them is perfectly fine, because ultimately the entire argument surrounding it is completely subjective. But too many people are actively calling out character redesigners as unilaterally bad for doing what they do, without considering any factor beyond what they personally feel about it, and I don't think that's fair. In my opinion, every character designer's individual intentions and execution should be considered when making any judgments about whether or not what they're doing is right or wrong, and even then, only with the understanding that that conclusion is solely based on their opinion and nothing factually, objectively correct. It's a worthwhile discussion to be had surrounding an artist's right to both reinterpret and criticize the work of others in particular settings, and conversely, the original creator's right to decide what is done with the characters they created. And in stating my opinions on the matter, I aim less to take a stance one way or the other, and more to bring attention to the reasoning of both sides and the points at the core of their arguments so that that discussion can be informed by what I feel to be the necessary context. But what do you guys think? Where do you stand on the issue of artists making videos and posts redesigning characters from popular media? Do you think individual context matters, or do you believe that without permission it's always disrespectful regardless? Please let me know in the comments, as I do sincerely want to hear your thoughts. Just please also stay respectful to each other if you end up debating the topic, because I can't state enough that this is a nuanced matter that's dependent largely, if not entirely, on opinion, not fact. And please be just as respectful to the artists doing these redesigns. Regardless of how you feel about what they're doing, they're human beings that deserve kindness and respect, both of which can be given even alongside criticism. And I very specifically mean criticism and not hate, because there's really no place here for the latter. Thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoyed today's video. Special thank you as always to channel members Joseph Solomon, TC Pratt, Zelda Deverak 42, Haruki Saluzzo, King Good James, CP Lil Thing, Art of Amethyst Fable, Extinction Animation, and Andy the Hedgehog, as well as patrons Batman, Kyle Lowe, Blue Swanson, Cora Fear, Jamisha Walker, Alengshi, Kim Yen, Crazy Asar, Gantong, Grayson Xavier, Blah Mage, TC Pratt, Finn, Celine Merriman, Ash, Eldritchia, The Stray Dog, Ulura, Greg Noble, Decagon, Jenny Chan, Catbus, Mac, Lucy Yamajiki, Selena Beebe, Pride Day, Totally Shogun, Insomniac Sleep Schedule, Ling Tang Wong, and Marie Greer, and I'll see you in the next one.